If you're like me, then Destiny 2 is one of the games you play the most. And if you play on a console, you might be wondering if it's worth upgrading to a next-gen console if you're mainly playing Destiny 2, either an Xbox Series console or a PS5. Well, the next-gen update for Destiny 2 is finally here, and with it came a slew of upgrades. Well, you might be wondering, are the changes noticeable and are they worth upgrading for if you mainly play Destiny 2? To answer that question, I took an Xbox Series X, Series S, Xbox One X, and One S head to head to compare and see how much improvement you can get by switching to next gen. I wasn't able to get my hands on a PlayStation 5, but I would imagine that the uplifts seen here are roughly on par with going from an Xbox One to an Xbox Series X. Looking at the TWAB in the next gen articles, I'm going to skip ahead a few items and go to what I think is the most interesting next gen upgrade, the load times. As someone who occasionally jumps back and forth from PC to console, playing on console would make me want to absolutely pull my hair out. The long initial boot times and matchmaking times were nearly double what I was seeing on PC, and in particular I felt like the menus were unbearably slow and sluggish when compared to the PC experience. Needless to say, I was excited for the next gen update to finally drop just so I could get some of that same snappiness on console that I can get on PC. Now, how this was written in the TWAB in the next gen update article was kind of vague. Faster loading times. So to figure out exactly what that meant, I conducted 8 different tests on a variety of systems in-game to not only figure out what benefited from the update, but how much difference I could see. I picked these tests based on what I experienced and noticed in the past, especially in the season of arrivals, and in areas I had a good feeling upgrades would be most noticeable in. I did this test on all 4 consoles, as well as my PC for comparison, to see how fast someone could load into the game and access their menus. For the PC test, I used a controller in order to minimize the number of variables in the test as possible. This was to make sure that there wasn't any discrepancy between using a mouse and keyboard versus controller inputs. From my own past experiences playing games on console, I knew that playing a game stored on an external storage device made a big difference in loading times in almost all games I've played. In my testing, I found that the degree of improvements you might see in Destiny 2, jumping to next gen from last gen, can be mitigated by some degree by playing the games stored on faster external drives on last gen consoles. These tests validated my gut feelings and proved that if you play Destiny 2 on either Xbox One or PS4, the game just runs better. In short, if you're going to stay on last gen consoles for the foreseeable future and continue to play Destiny 2, you should play it on an external drive, preferably a solid state drive. To be thorough, I tested how Destiny 2 performed on all the last gen hardware with not only the game stored on stock internal hard drives, but various external drives as well. I tested the game both on Xbox One X and Xbox One S, with the game stored on a Western Digital mechanical hard drive, the Samsung SATA 3 SSD, and this Intel M.2 NVMe drive. Additionally, because network connections can influence loading in Destiny, all the tests you see here in this video were conducted 3 times, and the results you see are averaged. Finally, the next gen update for Destiny 2 reclassifies it as a next gen game. What that means is that in order to play Destiny on a next gen console, it must be stored on the internal drive. Although you can store it on an external drive if you need the space and you don't plan on playing it for a while, but I'll talk about that a bit later. The first test I conducted is rather straightforward. How fast can you get into the tower starting from the system menus? This is measured from the moment the game was selected, spamming A as fast as possible, choosing a character, selecting the tower courtyard, until the moment my character could move. Interestingly enough, both the Xbox Series X and the Series S beat my PC in average game start times. Perhaps there are things I could do to optimize my PC a little bit better, but there aren't any intense processes running in the background that should slow it down, so I think it's a fair everyday comparison. It took the Xbox Series X about 84 seconds to complete this, the Series S about 95 seconds, the stock Xbox One X about 115 seconds, and the One S about 140. This means that the Series X performed about 65% faster than the base Xbox One S, and the Series S performed about 47% faster. When compared to the Xbox One X, the most powerful console of last generation, the Series X was only 37% faster loading into the tower, while the Series S was about 22% faster. The next test I conducted was to see how long it took to change inventory items on my character screen. Menus on last-gen consoles were notoriously bad. When you'd open any menu, it would take a few seconds for all the items and models to render. As you can see on the Series consoles, they're quite snappy and fluid. Not only were the Series consoles snappy to select items, but the game rendered the characters and inventory items much faster than the predecessors. I timed this from the moment I opened my menu and the screen went black until all the items were rendered on my character properly. It took the Series X about 10 seconds to swap all my items in the inventory. Same for the Series S, both nearly matching the PC performance. The only thing that caused them to lag a bit behind in the standings was that it would take a moment for helmets or ghosts to render after the menu was closed. Comparatively, the Xbox One X took almost 17 seconds to complete this task. The One S lagging even further behind at almost 30 seconds from start to finish. As mentioned at the beginning, the degree of these improvements over past gens could be mitigated by playing the game on external storage drives. Using SSDs in particular made navigating the menus and changing inventory items on last-gen consoles a bit more snappy, but not near as good as the next-gen successors. The third test was a test to see how long it took to navigate the character menus. When I was testing this, I didn't change screens until the game rendered all images and models, and all currencies were displayed. On last gen, it took a while for items to load, especially in the inventory, so if you wanted to pop something like a glimmer finder or something like that right before a strike, you usually were stuck in the menus for a moment while everything loaded. This could take forever on last gen consoles, and especially bad during season arrivals. To Bungie's credit, vaulting half the game seems to have dramatically sped up the way the game performed on last gen consoles. Still, you can see that the next gen consoles are performing much better and nearly as well as my PC did for this task. The next test was similar, but it was in the Director, Quests, and Eververse menus. For this test, I measured from the audible blip your character's arrow makes on the map and changed screens until I scrolled through all of them and then came back into the map and the arrow made the same audible blip. It took the Series X a little under 16 seconds to complete the task, the Series S just a tad behind at 17 seconds. The Xbox One X was way behind at almost 27 seconds. The One S performed abysmally on this test, almost doubling the time it took the Series X to complete it. The next test was a bit more practical. I wanted to see how long it took to load into a new destination once the game was already loaded. For this test, I traveled from the tower to the Trossland in the EDZ. I measured from the moment the launch countdown began until the screen began to shift from black into the game. It took the Series X an average of 36 seconds to complete this task, and it took the Series S just a bit longer at 37. Both performing about as well as you might expect, but slightly behind the PC. It took the Xbox One X about 52 seconds, and the One S about 53 seconds. This gave us load times for the Series consoles about 46% faster and 42% faster over the base Xbox One, or about 43 and 40% faster than the Xbox One X. For the sixth test, I again tried swapping inventory items, but this time on the EDZ, to see if the world or nearby combat had any noticeable impact on accessing the menu and swapping items. Like the first inventory swap test, I swapped all items on the character and stopped counting once all the items loaded on my character. This test in particular yielded some really eye-opening results. Can't really talk about how much the roof is being raised on these next-gen consoles until you talk about just how low the floor was on the base consoles last gen. And there were some really low floors. I managed to catch gems like this when I was running around the Xbox One S with the game saved on the internal hard drive. Notice here you can see my characters wearing the Festival of Lost gloves with vampire fingernails on the fingertips and the bluish green dress shirt sticking out of the cuff. Watch how long it takes the game to render my gloves and my weapons. And one thing that's most immediately obvious is that when I'm aiming down sights, because the weapon hasn't rendered, I don't have any crosshairs. You only get to see the reticle when I'm firing from the hip. So this makes it really difficult to try and hit anything. And you have this guy over here on the struggle bus with me. His character still hasn't loaded for me. Looking like Casper the Friendly Ghost. Wait, does he have a gun? Is that the Crimson? Maybe that isn't Casper. Maybe that's his brother Jasper, the Furious Ghost. Anyway, this takes forever. Running around here, minding my own business, waiting for the game to load. And this can be a big problem in Crucible if you're trying to swap weapons before a match. If you don't get into your menu and swap fast enough, you're going to lose all your ammo before the start of the game. And here at almost 43 seconds, you can see that my Festival of Lost ornament gloves finally swapped to the raid gear. Still waiting on my weapon to load. It looks like Jasper found himself a meat bag. And there it is, almost a minute and 10 seconds after I initially opened up my menu, all of my gear finally rendered on my character. I don't know how anyone on last gen put up with this, but there's still a lot of people playing on the base internal drives. This test really shows off what next gen consoles can do for Destiny 2. Looking at the results, I would like to point out that even though the series consoles yielded nearly similar results to the PC on this test, PC was a bit faster than my methodology might indicate. If you slow down the footage on the PC swap video, you can actually see items that have already rendered on my character before I even exit the menu. If you swap just a single item on the series consoles rather than the full inventory swap in my tests, you can actually catch weapons taking a second or two to render once you exit the menu. It's not game breaking, nor is it as bad as on the base Xbox Ones, but it's still noticeable to a degree when you compare it to the PC performances. One of the more interesting tests I conducted was where I tried to fast travel between zones in the same destination. This test was simply to travel between the Crosslands to the Winding Cove and the EDZ. I counted from the moment the select bar was filled up completely and the fast travel system began to kick in. I expected to see the same kind of improvements on next-gen consoles that I had consistently shown in all the previous testing, but the results came out looking like I shotgunned some numbers on the screen. Again, I want to emphasize I tested this 3 times on all systems and configurations. My testing found that the stock Xbox One X actually outperformed everything else, including itself using external solid-state drives. The One S almost performed nearly as well, and almost as well as the PC even. And like the Xbox One X, the stock One S outperformed itself with external solid-state drives. The only explanation for this that I can think of is that once the game loads into a particular zone, all the textures and models it needs are already cached in the system memory. From there, the time it takes to transfer zones is likely linked to network speeds. After seeing that loading into different landing zones in the same destination didn't really make a difference across the platforms, I tried one final test where I went around the horn on the director. This is where I started in the Crossland on the EDZ. Rotating clockwise, I loaded into one zone in every planet destination in the director. It took the Series X nearly 6 minutes and 17 seconds to complete the voyage. Series S about 6 minutes and 30 seconds, and the PC a bit behind at 6 minutes and 36 seconds. Both the Xbox One consoles posting times are approaching 9 minutes. Circling back around to the top of the next-gen features, we look at resolution. 4K resolution isn't what I would necessarily call a next-gen feature, because both the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro brought us 4K console gaming last generation, albeit with a dynamic resolution. To me, saying that the next-gen features includes 4K resolution is almost like saying that it includes audio and video. At this point, it's kind of implied. But jokes aside, maybe you didn't make that mid-generation upgrade to the Xbox One X or PS4 Pro, so it might be a new feature to you. It is a feature being supported by the new consoles minus the Series S, so we'll talk about it a little bit. If you've been living under a rock these last few years, a 4K image just has 4 times as many pixels on it as a 1080p image. This makes images smoother and less jagged, and in my opinion, it's a lot more noticeable when you're viewing it on flat edges like Vex architecture or Warmind weapons. It's also very noticeable on tiny objects like blades of grass, twigs, or small buttons on consoles in the game. My next favorite part about the next-gen update has to be the frame rate jump to 60 FPS. I've noticed a lot of people saying in online forums that they don't really understand what the big deal is about frame rate. To me, frame rate is to motion what 4K and 8K are to resolution. The more pixels you have on screen, the smoother and sharper the image looks. Similarly, the more frames you have displayed per second, the smoother the motion is on screen. Aside from games just looking and feeling more fluid, this can also have a huge impact on your performance in fast-paced shooters like Destiny 2, Apex Legends, Fortnite, etc. If you haven't already seen it, I highly suggest you check out this Linus Tech Tips video here on YouTube that thoroughly tests and explains how higher frame rate and refresh rate systems make it easier for players to land shots in shooters. In their video, they had several pro esport gamers such as Shroud, as well as a number of average gamers test their reflexes and aim in a variety of scenarios that are common in first-person shooters. They found that across the board, gamers performed better and landed more shots consistently when playing on higher frame rate and refresh rate systems than if they played on worse systems. In short, it doesn't matter if you're just a casual player who occasionally dips their toes in the Crucible, or the sweatiest tryhard in the Trials of Osiris, playing at a higher frame rate and refresh rate will make it easier for you to click on heads. This chart shows the average delay between frames being displayed to you across different refresh rates. The lower the frame time, the longer your eyes and brain have to wait for data to be displayed to them, which means you have to aim at moving targets with less information available to you than if you were playing at a higher frame rate in a higher refresh rate system. Almost all shooters in last gen consoles had a target frame rate of about 30 frames per second. In their video, Linus Tech Tips tested 3 of the most common target frame rates in competitive PC shooters: 60, 144, and 240 frames and hertz per second. Unsurprisingly, they noticed that the gap in player performance was largest, going from 60 frames and hertz to 144. This is also where we see the difference between frame times is the largest. They didn't test 30 frames per second and 30 hertz, which again was the target frame rate for almost all last gen console shooters, but just comparing the difference in frame times, you can imagine that the improvement in player performance going from 30 to 60 would be just as significant, if not larger, than the jump they saw going from 60 to 144. Best of all, if you get yourself a PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, you now have access to 120Hz Crucible Mode and 4 times the frame rate you previously had on last gen consoles. Anyway, I'd like to give Linus Tech Tips a big thank you for letting me use portions of their video in mine. If you find this interesting, you should go check out the full video, or at very least go check out the summary at the end. A link will be in the description below. Speaking of which, 120Hz Crucible Mode is now a thing. The addition of 120Hz Crucible Mode was announced on an Xbox Series launch stream by Xbox head Phil Spencer and Bungie CEO Pete Parsons. Because it was announced on a live stream, it was light on specifics. I had a lot of questions. Namely, would the game be locked at 4K 120, or would there be a 1080p or even 1440p 120 setting? If it were limited to only 4K 120, then it would severely limit the audience that can enjoy it. The reason why I even thought about this is because both the Xbox Series consoles and PS5 support the new HDMI standard, HDMI 2.1. HDMI 2.1 provides an ultra-fast data transfer up to 48 gigabits per second. This makes HDMI 2.1 the first and only HDMI standard that can carry a 4K 120 signal. If Bungie downscaled the resolution, it would make it so that HDMI 2.0 could carry the signal, which is what most TVs made in the last 10 years have. That being said, just before the release of the patch, Bungie updated the next gen article. In there they noted that if 120Hz mode was enabled, the game would lower the resolution and lower some of the advanced graphic settings. I was still curious to find out if 4K 120 would still be available if someone had the equipment to run it, or would the game lower the settings regardless of their setup. I can confirm that when 120Hz mode is enabled, the game lowers the resolution to 1440p regardless of whether or not you have the equipment to run a 4K 120 setup. This is huge because it widens the audience that can enjoy the 120Hz Crucible mode, because HDMI 2.1 is irrelevant. Now you're going to have to forgive the capture quality of this next section, but I was having issues with my Elgato capture card not playing nice with my G-Sync computer monitor. Thanks to randoms lurking in the dark recesses of tech hardware forums, I learned that apparently you can't run a refresh rate higher than 60Hz over HDMI 2.0 on a G-Sync monitor. That and my Elgato capture card actually can't capture 120 frames per second gameplay anyway, so I ended up using my Xbox DVR instead. One of the benefits to this is that I found out that if your display doesn't support 120Hz refresh rate, the game doesn't downgrade the graphic quality settings and not give you any benefits. And that's if you have the 120Hz Crucible mode selected and your display does not support 120Hz. The game and the system will keep the frame rate locked at 60 and the graphic settings the same. That being said, I was still curious to see what advanced graphic settings were being altered when 120Hz Crucible mode was enabled. To do this, I went into the PC settings and compared the differences between various levels, low, medium, high, etc., to get a feel for what the Xbox Series X was doing when 120Hz mode was toggled on. Starting at the top, looking at texture quality, shadow quality, and depth of field, I wasn't able to actually detect any noticeable changes, so I don't think these fields get changed at all when 120Hz mode is enabled. Environmental detail distance is the first area where I actually was able to pick out some differences that changed. For example, here on the Dead Cliffs with 120Hz mode enabled, if you're standing on this platform and looking off into the distance, when I step into this doorway, these buildings and these trees in the distance disappear from view. When you compare these PC settings, this is the equivalent to a low setting on the environmental detail distance. When you disable 120Hz Crucible mode, the draw distance for these details is much greater. When compared to PC settings, we find this is analogous to medium settings, because the detail of the structure and trees still change just a little bit. When we look at the PC's high settings, the draw distance for the details seems to be much higher than that. When 120Hz mode is enabled, when you look at 3D models like this tree way off in the distance, the range at which they turn to a 2D sprite is much lower. Again, this is analogous to low settings when we compare it to the PC graphics settings. When we disable 120Hz mode, the distance that these objects change from a 3D model to a 2D sprite is much greater. And again, this is analogous to medium settings on a PC. The next graphic setting I was actually able to detect any kind of difference in is the foliage detail distance. If we look at these plants here on the ground, the distance that they change from a 3D model to a texture is about this point. Again, this is analogous to low settings on the PC. When we disable 120Hz mode, we see that the draw distance for the foliage is roughly doubled. We find that this is analogous to medium settings on the PC. The next graphic setting I was able to detect a noticeable difference in was the foliage shadows distance. Here we'll take a look at the PC settings first. Here we can see that the lowest setting that you can possibly change it to on a PC is medium. Notice that the range that these shadows completely disappear off screen is about this point here, well outside of the bricks and the moss that's on the ground. Now if we look at the console and 120Hz mode is disabled, the distance that these shadows disappear is much closer than the medium settings on the PC. This would be analogous to about a low setting on a PC, which you can't even pick. When you enable 120Hz Crucible mode, the draw distance for these shadows lowers even more, so we get an actual lowest settings. Again, this is 2 notches lower than what you can pick on the PC. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have the ability to capture 120Hz gameplay, but just trust me, it's ultra smooth, unlike my aim. The next gen update for Destiny 2 also brought an adjustable field of view for the first time to consoles. If you have never played with a large field of view, then you don't really know what you're missing out on. But this, and the higher frame rate, makes the game seem so much faster and buttery smooth. Once you start playing it, it makes it difficult to go back. I can confirm that both the Series X and the Series S have the same ability to change the FOV as the PC, between 55 and 105 degrees. Besides just being able to see more stuff that's going on around you, having a higher field of view makes the game feel faster. It's because items off to your immediate flanks move faster relative to your direction of movement. What you're seeing on screen now is the difference between 75 FOV, the default, and the new max 105 degrees. You'll notice as I run down these alleyways that even though the characters are in the exact same spot at the same time, the narrower field of view makes it seem like the character's moving so much slower. You can notice this effect in real life too. For example, if you're driving in a car down the road, buildings that are in front of you but way off ahead seem to move much slower towards you than items that are off to your left and right as your car zips down the road. So in essence, by widening your field of view in the game, it's almost like you're able to notice more things that are zipping by your car. I've also included in this video the minimum FOV, which is 55 degrees. I basically never use 55 FOV unless I'm trying to zoom in on something intentionally. For example, when the Almighty crashed into Earth back in the Season of the Worthy, I used this to zoom in and spot the Almighty's silhouette against the sun. It's really the only time I would ever consider using this. Moving on, one of the best parts about the whole next-gen version arriving is the introduction of generational crossplay. Bungie put in massive work to make it so that cross-generation play is possible. My Destiny 1 players will remember that Destiny players on Xbox 360 couldn't play with players on Xbox One. Similarly, PS3 players couldn't play with anyone that was on a PS4. To me, this isn't talked about nearly enough, but it's absolutely huge. It lets players stay with their friends and it doesn't fragment the player base unnecessarily. And this reduces the lobby wait times trying to get into new games. In its current state, cross-generation play means that Xbox players can play with anyone on any Xbox console, next gen or last gen. Same goes for PS5 and PS4 players. Seriously though, Bungie deserves massive kudos for making this happen, and I can't wait for full crossplay to be enabled. As I mentioned earlier, you can't play the next-gen update for Destiny 2 if the game is stored anywhere but the internal drive. This is because both Sony and Microsoft made the decision to make NVMe SSD storage technology a requirement to run next-gen games, so expanding your storage is notoriously expensive. Microsoft opted to have a bespoke memory card style expansion drive that you plug into the back of your consoles, which currently goes for about $220 for a 1 terabyte expansion. Meanwhile, Sony designed the PS5 so that you have to use high-end Gen 4 M.2 NVMe drives that meets their rigorous specifications. As of this recording, Sony has yet to certify any of those manufacturers, but currently high-end Gen 4 NVMe drives for desktop PCs go for about $200 or more per terabyte. That being said, you can save the game to external drives, and it doesn't really matter what the specification is if you want to make room for something else. I measured how long it took to move the Destiny 2 game file to and from an internal drive from various external drive sources on all the different consoles. As you can see, if you get yourself a 2.5-inch SATA 3 SSD drive like the Samsung QVO I tested, you can save yourself a bit of money because SATA 3 SSDs are typically much cheaper than NVMe drive, and it transferred data rather comparably. So in closing, I would say that Destiny 2 runs wonderfully both on the Xbox Series X and the Series S compared to last-gen consoles. They managed to beat the last-gen consoles easily and post similar loading times to the high-end PC that I compared them to. Load times are dramatically reduced, menus are snappier and more responsive. It no longer takes you ages to equip items. You get 60 frames a second and a buttery smooth presentation. And for the Crucible connoisseurs out there, you get a nifty 120 frames per second mode if you're on the Series X or PS5. Last but certainly not least, console editions of the game now have that adjustable field of view slider. I recommend you bump that baby all the way up and enjoy the new faster game presentation. And like I said, the game ran well on both series consoles, so if you're on a little bit of a budget, Series S might be an appealing option for you. But the only difference that you could possibly notice is that it doesn't have the 4K resolution and it doesn't have the 120Hz Crucible mode. That being said, I still think the next gen Destiny experience on Series S isn't something to be overlooked, especially when you consider that you could still pair it with something like Xbox Game Pass, which has Destiny 2, Shadowkeep, and Beyond Light all included. For anyone that might be watching and can't make the jump to next gen yet for a myriad of reasons, for example, maybe you lost the in-stock lottery when you tried to pre-order, or maybe you're just waiting for a price drop next year. Whatever your reason might be, you can get a better Destiny experience right now on last gen tech if you move your game file to a SSD. You'll notice faster loading times, snappier menus, and quicker inventory swapping, though still not quite as good as the next gen. Nor will you be able to get the next gen features like that 60 FPS or the FOV slider. But trust me, move the game to an SSD if you can. You'll thank me later. Well, that does it for me. If you found this video helpful, drop me a like on the video. If you didn't like it, I'd appreciate a like anyway. Thank you. See you next time.